Hello and welcome. I'm Susie Maddock. I'm the Managing Director of Berkeley Repertory Theater, and it's just great to have you all here with us. It was in 2016 when Mayor Jesse Arreguín delivered his first State of the City address to the city of Berkeley in the Rhoda Theater. I was honored, therefore, when he invited me to give tonight's introduction. It feels as though this is bringing us all sort of full circle, since this is the last State of the City under his first term. Now, I want to ask you for just a moment to bear with me and to engage in an exercise with me. I want you to all close your eyes for a moment and imagine a post-pandemic time when you're sitting in the Rhoda Theater again, surrounded by people just like you who care deeply about this city. Just enjoy the feeling of being with all of those people for just one moment. And now you can open your eyes again. So we've all experienced how much the world has changed over the last 4 years, indeed, certainly over the last 4 months. Most of us had never heard of Zoom before last January, and now it's our lifeline to each other. The arts and cultural community in particular has been hit really, really hard. And as a city that prides itself on the importance of the arts and culture, partially to give us a sense of who we are, and also because of our contribution to the economic well-being of the city, it should come as no surprise that this mayor really quickly jumped in when things fell apart. Mayor Arreguín worked with other community leaders, and he led the way to quickly rally support for our artists and our arts organizations. On the same day that shelter in place was mandated, Mayor Arreguín stepped up, led the council to launch the Berkeley Relief Fund, which raised over $4.3 million in grants for renters, for small businesses, and for arts organizations. At that time, Berkeley Rep was just blessed to receive a $24,000 grant from the city, which at that moment just made us feel like someone remembered that we were there and that we weren't utterly abandoned. That same day, the council passed strong recommendations for both residential and commercial tenants, prohibiting evictions that many of our residents, including many artists, would have likely faced in this just unprecedented crisis. During the last 4 years under this mayor, the city has championed the development of affordable housing for residents across the spectrum of backgrounds. Housing has been a huge issue for us. Here in Berkeley, in our community, as an arts organization, we've been very, very, very grateful to have the mayor's support in making a new housing project for artists just on our block in Addison Street. Knock on wood, if all goes well, we're going to open a 45-unit building right next door to the Rhoda Theater within a couple of years. And we could not have done this without the full support of the mayor, the city manager, the city council, and all of the staff. It's been an opportunity for people to work in unison toward a common goal. And we know that leadership always comes from the top. So we at Berkeley Rep think of ourselves as being a reflection of this city. While our stages have been closed, our imaginations and our creativity are still going full bore. And I think that, like us, the city is itself a city of resilience and ingenuity, and just like us. The city is always looking for a way to move forward. I've watched with admiration as the mayor, working with so many of our council members, have built alliances across political spectrum to build consensus around many of the really difficult, knotty, complicated issues that exist in a city like ours. And their ability to do that has given me just great hope and confidence as I think back to the moment that we all experienced just a moment ago, where we imagined what we're going to look like at the other side of this, imagining ourselves back in the Rhoda Theater in a post-pandemic world. This has given me the comfort to think that when we come out of this, the work that we're doing now, the hard work that our leaders are doing, that our citizens are doing, are going to make us fully prepared and eager to re-engage. With that in mind, I want to introduce tonight's panel of conversationalists. I want to introduce Sarah Ravani, who covers the East Bay at the San Francisco Chronicle. Her coverage includes City Hall in Oakland, Berkeley, and other East Bay cities. She also covers issues around homelessness. Welcome, Sarah. I want to introduce Erin Baldassari, who is a housing reporter for KQED and host of the new podcast, Sold Out, Rethinking Housing in America. Her past life was in newspapers, where she most recently worked as the transportation reporter for the San Jose Mercury News and East Bay Times. She grew up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada Mountains and in Sonoma County. So welcome, Erin. And then Emilie Raguso is Berkeleyside senior editor of news. She's been covering City Hall, public safety, I will say the arts, and housing in Berkeley for nearly a decade. In 2017, Emilie was named Journalist of the Year by the Society of Professional Journalists, NorCal Board. Emilie previously launched and ran the community news site Albany Patch for the city of Albany, California. And her stories have appeared in the New York Times website, Salon, and NPR. Welcome Emilie. And now it is my great honor to introduce the mayor of our great city, Jesse Arreguín.
Well, thank you, Susie, for that kind introduction. And I look forward to being able to return to the Berkeley Rep in the 2021 season. In the meantime, the Berkeley Rep has gone virtual, providing an extensive list of online classes for those that are interested. Visit Berkeley Rep, all one word, berkeleyrep.org for details. As Susie has mentioned, a lot has changed, with 2020 being a year unlike any we have ever experienced. And COVID-19 has transformed the way we operate. And I know it's been a challenge that all of us have had to endure. Whether it's readjusting your schedule to help your child as they learn from home, having your job impacted, or taking care of a loved one who has contracted the coronavirus, we all have had to adapt to make sacrifices for the betterment of our society. And when the first case of COVID-19 in the United States was announced in January, later that month, we launched the Emergency Operations Center here in Berkeley to begin preparing for a potential pandemic. And when the first case was confirmed in Berkeley on March 3rd, we issued a state of emergency. And 2 weeks later, the world as we knew it dramatically changed as health officers throughout the Bay Area announced the shelter-in-place order. These actions undoubtedly saved lives. And I want to thank our health officer, Dr. Lisa Hernandez, the hundreds of city employees who have worked on our COVID-19 response, and you, the Berkeley residents, for stepping up and for following public health and social distancing protocols. While the COVID-19 crisis has been at the forefront of 2020, that has not stopped our work in leading Berkeley forward. Because of your support for Measures O and P in 2018, we have been able to fund over 400 units of affordable housing, with much more in the pipeline. We have been able to provide meaningful homeless services, lifting hundreds of individuals off the streets and into permanent housing. Paired with our increased investment in anti-displacement programs, homelessness in Berkeley at a third of the rate of the county average. We have embarked on historic policing reforms to bring us closer to achieving our dream of equal justice for all while making every member of our community safer. We have taken action to address one of the greatest threats to humanity, our climate crisis, by banning natural gas in new construction and phasing out throwaway single-use plastics, both of which have become national models, while launching Vision 2050, a generational approach to improving infrastructure through technological innovation, like a Berkeley Green New Deal. And while we typically hold the State of the City address in the summer, this year we decided to push it back as we've been focused on our response to COVID-19. Given the unique situation that we face and not being able to hold a traditional State of the City address in front of a live audience, we decided to change things up a bit. So instead of me giving a speech for 30 minutes, I'll be answering questions with three of the Bay Area's rockstar journalists, Emilie Raguso from Berkeleyside, Erin Baldassari from KQED, and Sarah Ravani from the San Francisco Chronicle. I have not been given an advance copy of their questions, so look forward to their questions. And with that, I want to thank you all for agreeing to participate in this unique 2020 State of the City. And I look forward to answering your questions. And Emilie, let's get this conversation started.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to all of us. And I was going to say something similar about how you changed the format up, but you've already described that really well. So our plan tonight, as you said, we didn't give you questions in advance, but we agreed among ourselves about sort of which topics we were going to talk about, and we shared those with you. And just so everyone else knows what the plan is, we're essentially, the three of us are going to rotate through 5 or 6 different topics. They include COVID-19, homelessness, housing, the city economy, and public safety. And we'll see what else we get to. So with that, I think what we'll start with tonight is COVID-19. And we're not going to be able to get really deep into any of these topics. They're all very complicated, but I think we've tried to pick questions that dig into a lot of the questions we've gotten from the community and some of the things that I think will shed light on an interesting angle of these complex dynamics. So starting off with a really easy one for you, Mayor. Berkeley is unique in a lot of ways, but as far as COVID-19 and the city's kind of approach to services, Berkeley is one of the very, very few cities in the state that has its own health department. And that's been a hot topic of debate this year. The department budget is about $10.5 million. And the argument for it is that the city can really control the local resources and tailor the programs to meet the needs of the community. But then we also have some challenges at times where, for example, we haven't been able to get data about the demographics of who has died or how many people are hospitalized. And these are things people in the community want to know. How many people have recovered? Those are things that the city hasn't released. On top of that, when it comes to the state's framework for reopening, Berkeley's kind of lumped in with Alameda County. So even if our numbers are way better, as you know, we have had a lower positivity rate and things like that, we're still lumped in with the county as far as what we can do. So the question for you is, do you see having a Berkeley Health Department as being worth that $10.5 million budget? Why or why not?
Well, I think there are advantages to having our own health department. We can issue our own public health orders based on our own local conditions. And so in Berkeley, we have a lower rate of COVID-19 infections and hospitalizations than in Alameda County. A challenge, as you note, is that the state of California does not recognize Berkeley as its own public health jurisdiction. And so decisions are made on a countywide level. And so we've been working in coordination with not just Alameda County, but with all the regional health officers on a coordinated Bay Area response. I think there are also advantages in that we are eligible for federal and state grants, which we can use for expanded testing and contact tracing. One of the challenges, as you note, is data and coordination of our response. So I think at the conclusion of this pandemic, I think we should evaluate whether Berkeley should continue to have its own standalone health department. But I do think there have been advantages, such as accessing millions of dollars of funds that we've been able to use for our testing and our local COVID response.
Thank you. It's definitely a complicated question. Now, just something a little more big picture. I'd love for you to talk briefly about some of the things you think the city has been most successful at as far as the pandemic, but also maybe a couple challenges that the city's faced. For example, I think testing was a little bit slow to start up, but the city has also accomplished a lot. So could you just speak briefly about that?
Well, I think some of the great things that we've done is, we were one of the first jurisdictions, along with our Bay Area partners, to implement a shelter-in-place order, and that was really critical to slow the spread of the virus early on. And I think that's why in the Bay Area, and I'll just note San Francisco has had a really successful rate of controlling COVID, that we've been able to keep our positivity rate at generally under 2%. We have done a lot to help our unhoused community, knowing that we do not have shelter or permanent housing for everyone, with real focus on seniors and the most vulnerable to complications due to COVID-19. And the work that we've been able to do to support our business community and our residents through the Berkeley Relief Fund, through the eviction moratoria that we've adopted, I think has also made an impact. Challenges are certainly testing. We don't have enough testing to be able to test everyone in our community, and testing is going to be critical to reopening our schools. And so we're working with our school district in that area. Another challenge is we are home to the University of California, Berkeley, which is the home to thousands of students, some of whom have come back to Berkeley. And so that required a sort of extra coordination with UC around their protocols, their testing. And then we've also had issues around students who've been in congregate living situations who have contracted COVID-19, and it's spreading as well. We've done a lot of work to focus on our nursing homes, outreach with the student community, and also with our African American and Latinx population to make sure that we have focused testing and outreach to those communities. Those communities are most vulnerable to COVID-19. Ultimately, what we need is a huge federal infusion of dollars to not only support our public health response, but also our economic response to COVID-19. And we will continue to fight with elected officials throughout California for a new CARES Act bill, which we so desperately need.
Thank you. You mentioned the homelessness and how much the city has done this year for the unsheltered community. And I think that's a great segue to move to Sarah, who's going to be asking some questions about homelessness in Berkeley.
Thanks, Emilie. Hi, Mayor. Thanks for having me tonight. As you know, homelessness in the county and in Berkeley has been steadily increasing over the past few years. You've previously said that your number one priority is to end homelessness. And in January, the city passed a resolution to open an outdoor emergency shelter. Those plans were put on hold as the entire region struggled to confront a new crisis, the coronavirus pandemic. In September, you said you'd like to revamp plans for the first sanctioned camp and get it up and running in 30 days. And you also said that you plan to close the Seabreeze encampment on University Avenue near the freeway entrance. My first question is, where does the city stand on achieving both of these initiatives, and where will people be told to go once the Seabreeze encampment is closed?
Well, we're not going to close the encampment unless we have a location to relocate people to, where they can either shelter or connect them to hotel rooms or permanent housing. That is not only federal law, but that's also the right thing to do. And so we've been working with Caltrans, with East Bay Parks, on an approach to ultimately connect people to shelter, but in the short term to improve the conditions down there. It is a growing health and safety problem. And so hopefully within the next week or two, we will be working in coordination to clean up those properties. So if people are sheltering there, they're at least living in a habitable condition. In terms of the outdoor shelter, we are looking for locations in the city of Berkeley and also looking for locations regionally. Council did allocate money in our budget to be able to launch this program. One of the challenges with COVID is that, we had doubled the number of shelter beds in Berkeley. We had to decompress those shelters because people were living in such close quarters. And so you are seeing more people on the streets because we don't have shelter beds for them. We have leased 2 hotels working with Alameda County to move people into. We're looking at leasing additional hotels. We're looking at buying trailers and siting trailers in city parking lots. And we're looking at this outdoor shelter, I think modeled after San Francisco's outdoor shelter that they recently implemented. All this is going to be really critical to let people shelter in place and shelter in place safely. But we have to continue to work towards the goal of housing first. And permanent housing is a solution to homelessness. And, we have a significant gap in housing for the many people that need housing, not just in Berkeley, but in the East Bay. We need to buy buildings. We need to master lease buildings. We need to access the state funding. All these are things that we're going to be working on in the coming months.
Governor Gavin Newsom pledged $137 million in funding for the state's Home Key project, an initiative to repurpose hotels and vacant apartment buildings into permanent housing. You mentioned leasing 2 hotels in the county, but I'm wondering if Berkeley has applied for any of the funds through the governor's program, and if so, how much, and what will the city do with the funds if they're awarded? And if Berkeley hasn't applied yet, why not?
We are we've applied for my understanding, 2 specific projects. One is working with the county, the acquisition of a hotel in Berkeley. And as well, we're exploring applying for funding to help fund a very innovative homeless housing project that's proposed on University Avenue in Berkeley that would provide roughly 40 units of permanent supportive housing, which would be run by BOSS. And so we are waiting to hear back about our application. One of them was in partnership with the county. One we're exploring as the city of Berkeley. And we're looking at other properties that we can identify and apply for funding for, because we know that 2 projects is not enough. We need to significantly expand the amount of permanent supportive housing.
And my last question is just, as you know, the number of people living in RVs has also increased exponentially, especially in the last few years. In 2019, the city passed an overnight parking permit program for RV dwellers, but enforcement plans were put on hold. What are the long-term plans for RV dwellers in the city?
Well, we are not enforcing that regulation given the public health crisis that we're facing. We feel that people should be allowed to shelter in place. We are asking people to not litter, and to be mindful of various laws while they're sheltering in place. Long-term, the solution is to find one or more locations for people to park their vehicles long-term, and to have sanitation and to access services. Our neighboring city of Oakland has opened a couple of safe RV sites. We've been working very closely with Mayor Libby Schaaf and the administration in Oakland on a North County approach to how we serve the needs of people sheltering in vehicles. One city can't pass a policy and then push the problem onto another city. We have to work together. And so we'll be working together and hopefully in partnership with Alameda County to identify locations where we can allow people to safely park, applying for funding to operate these safe RV parking sites, and then also working to provide services so that those that are ready to transition into permanent housing can do so. So those plans were on hold. In addition, we were looking at letting RVs park in some of the city parking lots as part of a permit system. That is on hold, but we hope to be able to implement that when the COVID pandemic is over, hopefully in the near future. And while we're working on a longer term solution, which is a regional approach, because we can't keep resolving these issues city by city. We can't have a siloed approach to homelessness. It's got to be done regionally. We have to work together.
Thank you. Just maybe quickly piggybacking on that, and then before moving to the next topic, very briefly, I've seen so many reports assessing different sites for these different programs you've mentioned. Do you believe there are any sites in Berkeley where these can actually take place? Because every time it sort of comes time to actually advance, we hear, oh, that site can't work. Are there sites in Berkeley that will work?
There are. They are limited, unlike, Oakland or even Richmond. Some of the sites that we were hoping to use, there are legal constraints. There are impacts we have to manage. But there are several sites that we are exploring. There also is a voter-approved law called Measure L, which says that we can't use any land that has been classified as open space or parks for non-recreation uses. And there are a couple of parcels, such as the Lawn Bowling Green in West Berkeley and the North Bowling Green, which could be used for housing or tiny homes or an outdoor shelter. And so we're trying to find, ideally, one large enough location to do this. One of the constraints in Berkeley is we're so built out. We're such a dense city that there just aren't a lot of large pieces of land available. The HS Lordship property down at the waterfront, that's governed by state lands and BCDC. There are legal constraints around using that. So we're continuing to look. And, I hear from people at Berkeley all the time that they are deeply concerned about seeing so many people on the streets, and they want to get people off the streets. Well, I think we need to open our hearts as well. If there's a location in your neighborhood where we want to open a shelter or we want to have a safe parking site, to be open to that, to not be opposed to that, because we're not going to solve the homeless crisis by pushing it onto some other community. We need to do our part, and we need to open our minds and our hearts to the fact that these are our neighbors, these are human beings, they need the love and support that we need to provide them to help them move on a path to self-sufficiency. So we will continue to look and we will continue to push and find a place in Berkeley, but while we're also looking for regional solutions as well.
All right, well, we look forward to hearing more. As far as shelter, now we're going to move to Erin to talk about housing. And so Erin, take it away.
Thanks so much, Emilie, and thank you, Mayor Arreguín, for having us, and thank you, Emilie, for so graciously stepping up to be our moderator tonight as well. You were talking about barriers to affordable housing, and one of the things that's sort of near and dear to my heart is looking at some of the history of that. Berkeley was the first city in the country to establish single-family zoning. These are rules that make it illegal to build anything other than one home on one lot in certain neighborhoods. And that's, one of the drivers of racial segregation that is still very present in Berkeley today. So what's the city's plan to actively desegregate its neighborhoods and not just place low-income housing in neighborhoods that have traditionally been lower income, but also to locate that housing in wealthier neighborhoods?
Well, I'm proud that this past Thursday, I was at the groundbreaking of the first affordable housing project in North Berkeley in 30 years. It's going to provide 34 units of affordable housing for formerly homeless seniors. And that was actually a partnership with a local church who had land that they wanted to use and they wanted to be part of the solution. We need to do more of that. We cannot just concentrate growth in the flatlands. We need to look at opening up every part of our city. And as you know, I tweeted about this yesterday. Unfortunately, this is sadly part of Berkeley's history, is that single-family zoning in Berkeley was created to exclude people of color from the Claremont and from the Elmwood neighborhood. And that is the foundation upon which our city is built. And I think that just goes to show how deeply ingrained systemic racism is in every aspect of our society. And now it's clearly manifesting itself in the housing crisis. Over 50% of the people who are homeless are African American. Once again, an example of systemic racism. In addition, there are barriers to formerly incarcerated people being able to access housing. And we were able to pass a fair chance policy in Berkeley, which will be going into effect soon, to lift those barriers so the formerly incarcerated can find places to live. So I think we need zoning reform in the city of Berkeley. But we have to approach it thoughtfully, and we have to go neighborhood by neighborhood and have conversations with people. We also have to be mindful of the fact that some parts of our city are in the fire zone, and just be mindful about how much additional growth we're putting in certain areas where roads are narrow, where emergency egress is limited, and where there's extreme fire risks on the wildland-urban interface. So I support zoning reform in Berkeley. We launched a process through the missing middle study to look at adding additional density in our single-family residential neighborhoods. We also need to do it regionally. And so as president of ABAG, through this RHNA, this Regional Housing Needs Allocation, I have to remember to recite the acronyms that I cite, which is every 8-year process that we're engaged in to distribute housing throughout the region. We are mandated now to affirmatively further fair housing. But as part of that, I think we have an opportunity to correct the many, many decades and generations of racial exclusion that have prevented people of color and lower income families from living in some of the more exclusive parts of our region. That's my goal, and it's going to be controversial, but I think it has to happen. If we really believe in racial equity and ending systemic racism, that has to be manifested in our housing policies.
Could you give an example of how you see that playing out in Berkeley?
Sure. Some of our single-family residential neighborhoods do allow triplexes and quadplexes, but the R1 and R1A neighborhood, which does account for a very large part of our residential neighborhoods, does not. But interestingly, before zoning changes in the 70s, we see apartment buildings in single-family residential neighborhoods. These were built for many, many years. So this is not a radical idea. I think it's in keeping with the development pattern that we see in a lot of our neighborhoods. And the only way that we're going to meet those RHNA targets, those new requirements, Berkeley's going to have to build plan for and build anywhere between 6,000 to 7,000 additional units. We're going to have to look at zoning in our neighborhoods, because if we can only build so much in downtown Berkeley and on University Avenue, we have to look at densifying our corridors. San Pablo Avenue is a regional corridor. We're looking at bus rapid transit in San Pablo as part of larger transit and pedestrian project and bike improvement project there, I think we also have to look at the zoning and how we can accommodate greater density in San Pablo as well.
I want to talk about another sort of transit-oriented development, and particularly at the North Berkeley and Ashby BART stations. The Planning Commission recently released some recommendations for housing at Ashby BART that included, an aspirational goal of 100% affordable housing there, as well as a right to return for residents who have been displaced from Berkeley. Do you support those recommendations?
I support the goal of 100% affordable housing at the Ashby station. Now, we need to understand how much that would cost and how we would be able to fund a 100% affordable project. I think we should aspire to that. And through Berkeley's Measure O Bond, we can make a sizable contribution. We need to look at regional sources. We need to look at private sector funding. I think that should be what we aspire to. That's what the community's asked for in Ashby Station. North Berkeley Station, I think we need a mix of market rate, moderate, and low-income housing. I think there are opportunities for first-time homeownership as well as for apartments there. What I'm excited about is creating up to 1,400 new homes at these two locations and creating whole new neighborhoods and complete streets projects and, moving our flea market to a new location and having it be vibrant and, extending the Ohlone Greenway. So I support the goal, but the devil's in the details, and we have to look at the economic feasibility analysis. At the end of the day, we want something built there. And so, if we want to see housing there and we want it to be 100% affordable, we're going to have to identify the funding. And that's going to require, I think, the work of the city and working with regional and state and private sector partners to make that happen. So I'm excited that we're moving the Adeline Corridor Plan forward. We have to balance all these different issues: affordability, parking, access. I support the right to return policy, and I hope that we'll advance that this next year, not just in the Adeline corridor, but citywide.
You also introduced a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act earlier this year, which would give tenants and nonprofits the first right to buy their building from their landlord if it goes up for sale. We haven't heard much about that since the onset of the pandemic. So what's the status of that? And if it's gone through some changes, could you describe some of those changes and tell us where it's headed now?
No amendments have been made yet. This was sent to our land use committee. And after the election, and probably it's at the end of this year, beginning of next year, we're going to be launching outreach to various stakeholder groups, landlords, people in real estate finance, tenant advocates, land trusts, to get further input on the ordinance, because that was one of the things that we were asked to do, was to get additional stakeholder input. And then I hope by the beginning of next year to make a recommendation to the city council. So, this is a very exciting, ambitious proposal. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of misinformation that's been put out there about it. Some property owners think that we're literally taking your home. No, what we're talking about is when you sell your property, you give your tenants the right of first refusal, which they can either elect or working in partnership with a nonprofit or land trust. We think this is really critical to provide some stability for tenants in Berkeley, to ensure long-term ownership in the community, and to preserve the economic and cultural diversity of our city. So no changes have been made yet. We still are intending to move the conversation forward next year. And one of the things we did hear from property owners and from some council members is looking at the issue around transfers between sort of heirs to estates, and looking at the issue of duplexes, looking at the applicability standards. So all these are things that we're going to be looking at, but Berkeley's introduced one, Oakland's introduced one. It is different from COPA in that it gives tenants the right of first refusal. And really critical to this is the funding, and to help tenants organize so that they can exercise their option. And so we're going to be working on all those different pieces as this legislation moves through the process.
And then lastly, the latest housing pipeline report from Berkeley showed that the city has built less than a quarter of the affordable housing that it needs to meet its state targets, those RHNA numbers that you were talking about. What can the city do to help facilitate the construction and development of affordable housing within the city. And I'm talking about things like fast tracking approval, clearing some of the red tape, helping those projects get off the ground so they don't see some of the same years of resistance to them that often slows down and makes that housing much more affordable and harder to build.
Well, according to our analysis of our building permits, while 22 units were reported on the RENA report, actually 338 BMR units were approved, but have not yet accessed their building permits. So, and there are other projects that will be coming down the pipeline in the future. So that is less than the amount of above market rate units. And I think one of the biggest challenges, as you know, is cost, is the cost to a project and the financing of a project. And it costs anywhere between $500 to $1 million a unit to build an affordable unit, depending on the type of project and the type of construction. So we need to do several things. We need to fast track the process. SB 35 has helped a lot because most projects in Berkeley are eligible for SB 30, affordable housing project, eligible for SB 35 streamlining. But we do need to look at what local streamlining we can put in place for those affordable housing projects. We did refer to the Planning Commission to look at streamlining projects of 50% or more affordable housing. So even a mixed market rate and affordable project could get streamlined under the legislation that we had introduced. And we also have to look at the type of construction. By encouraging more modular housing and prefabricated housing, that not only reduces the amount of time involved in building a project, it reduces the cost. And then lastly, the city needs to continue to provide that local match, which we're able to match 6-to-1 between the private and the state funding sources. And so Measure O has been helpful, our Measure U1 tax. We need to really continue to prioritize affordable housing if we're actually going to want to keep our economic and cultural diversity in our city. So it's the process, it's the financing, the method of construction. All those things will make a big difference.
All right, we need to move on. But before we do, I do want to point everyone to Erin's piece she did with Molly Solomon on KQED earlier this week, the racist history of single-family home zoning, which was related all about Berkeley. Everybody should check it out if they haven't already. But we're going to move on now to public safety. A couple of questions about public safety. So a recent Berkeleyside analysis had found that gun violence is up this year in Berkeley, as it is in a number of cities across the nation. Last year in Berkeley, one person was fatally shot, and 3 people were wounded. This year, those numbers have basically tripled. There have been 3 people fatally shot and at least 10 who have been wounded. And we still have a few months to go. So what is your plan to address gun violence in Berkeley?
Well, as you acknowledge, sadly, we're seeing an increase in gun violence and shootings during this pandemic. It's happening in cities throughout the entire region. And, we've had a number of people who have died in Berkeley due to gun violence. It's tragic. We're focused on investigating those cases and identifying the people involved. And oftentimes it's a small number of people who are most responsible for these incidences of gun violence, getting the guns off the street, because that makes a big difference. But I think by not just sort of increasing our sort of police presence in those neighborhoods that have been impacted, there was a recent shooting last Friday in West Berkeley. And so we've increased our patrols and reaching out to neighbors in that particular neighborhood while we're doing our investigation. But long term, what we need to focus on is addressing the root causes of crime and the sort of work with our schools and our young people to prevent people from engaging in crime and preventing violence from happening. And so, some of the shootings that have happened over the last few years have been directly related to gang violence. And so we have to have a focused effort on engaging current and former gang members to work out differences and to prevent violence from happening. But we need to ultimately invest in the social determinants that lead to crime: education, jobs, housing, to create better opportunities for our young people. So, the short term is we're focused on sort of investigating these shootings, and our police have active leads, and they've already arrested some of the suspects involved in some of the shootings that have happened this year. Long term, we have to focus on violence prevention. We have to focus on restorative justice. We need to give young people better opportunities so that they do not end up in pursuing crimes. I think we have to focus on the long term and the short term. And
you mentioned increasing resources at times when there are times and places where there have been violence. A lot of the very important discussions that have been happening this year locally and nationally have been about defunding and actually kind of reimagining and reducing resources in different ways. As you know, the bulk of Berkeley PD's budget is staffing, is police officers. So do you advocate firing officers to accomplish this defunding, since that's where the money is spent? And if not, then how do you see reducing the budget without doing that? Well, I think I don't want to ascribe to the phrase defund the police. I think what we're really talking about is reinvesting funds from a police department budget to support public safety broadly. And that's what we're exploring in the city of Berkeley. We also have to focus on community policing. Sort of touching on the last question, by getting officers out of their cars, walking beats, building relationships, that also helps keep our community safer. So that's got to be a key piece of the conversation. But we did not immediately institute a 50% cut in Berkeley, although that was proposed, because we didn't know what the impact of that would be and how many police officers and personnel would be fired and what the impact that would be on our ability to deliver public safety services to our community. What we did decide to do is to launch a citywide process to do an audit of our police department, to understand our budget, to understand how officers are using their time, and then to look at ways to shift certain work that has increasingly become the focus of the police department, such as responding to mental health calls and traffic stops and police officers responding to calls related to homelessness, shifting some of those resources towards community programs and services to prevent the need for a police officer to respond. And that will free up time for our police to focus on what they were trained to do, which is to deal with violent and serious crime. The idea of moving traffic stops out of our police department is a very new idea. But does it make sense for a police officer to respond to a car accident? Does it make sense for our police to stop somebody for a routine traffic stop that is not doesn't pose a threat to other motorists or other people in our community? And then we know increasingly that police stops, traffic stops, are the main way that communities of color interact with our police department. And people have died in those traffic stops. So by looking at shifting traffic stops into a new Department of Transportation that's focused on Vision Zero, that's focused on racial equity, by looking at a specialized care unit to do enhanced mental health response, we think that we can reduce the size of the police budget by shifting some of those costs and those functions and free up our police to be able to focus on what they need to do, which is deal with those violent, serious crimes, including the shootings that you had talked about. And I'd like to ask one more public safety question about what you're talking about. And then if we can have maybe 3 or 4 more minutes so Sarah can ask about the budget, that would be great. But what I would like to know is, as you brought up this idea of the Department of Transportation, and I'm just curious how you envision car stops taking place when we're talking about, a number of these stops sometimes involve people on parole, people who have violent criminal histories. They may be armed, they have guns in the car. How do you see that happening with unarmed city staff? How do you see that working out? Well, in Oakland, they've actually changed their approach to how they do traffic stops, where they're really focused on traffic stops where there is sort of the greatest sort of risk or they're dealing with potential suspects. And so by looking at models in other jurisdictions to look at sort of prioritizing traffic stops, our hope is that those traffic stops that aren't high priority and don't pose a risk to public safety, those will be done by unsworn personnel. There's a lot that we have to figure out. We have to look at changing state law. We have to look at the sort of the
the operational issues. But I think now's the time to start the conversation. And once again, I mean, does it make sense for a police officer to respond to a car accident or somebody with a broken taillight and rather focus on the activity that poses a greater risk to the community? I would also argue that, we have mental health crisis response workers. We have code enforcement staff. We have other city staff that do respond to calls for service, and sometimes things escalate, and we do have to call the police to respond because it does pose a risk to that employee. And so I would imagine similarly that personnel through the Department of Transportation, if something does escalate and they need an immediate response and they need backup, they can call the police department and they would respond as well. My hope is by having the police not respond to those 35% of calls that are increasingly related to mental health related incidents, that they'll be more quickly able to respond when there's an incident that needs their intervention.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll close the night with a few questions from Sarah about the city budget.
Thanks, Emilie. So Mayor, in June, Berkeley said the city was facing a $40 million budget shortfall for the fiscal year that began on July 1st. To address the gap, staff came up with a list of projects that could be put on hold, and some of that included hiring freezes for vacant positions across different city departments. My question is, how will this affect the city's capabilities to provide services? And from a resident's perspective, what changes will they notice?
So the budget balancing plan that we adopted to close our $40 million deficit did require the deferral of a number of positions throughout the city organization. We are prioritizing positions related to our COVID response and also public safety. So we were very thoughtful in determining which positions to defer. These are deferrals, they're not cuts. Nobody was laid off. So as to not, significantly impact city services. And so all the city services, our refuse collection and zero waste program, our finance department, our planning department, all those services will continue to be provided, albeit we are transitioning to a virtual platform because we're not quite ready to have people waiting in long lines to apply for their residential parking permits or zoning permits. And I hope that after this pandemic, that the efficiencies that we have implemented to move certain functions and services online will continue, because that will save costs and I think will improve customer service and better serve the community. So residents are not going to see a reduction in baseline services. We were very thoughtful in how we created our budget balancing plan. I am, mindful of the fact that, we're going to be facing 6 more months of the UC Berkeley campus being closed and, loss of tax revenue, and that is going to result in some difficult decisions next year as well.
Okay, thank you.
So did you have any more questions, either of you, that you wanted to ask?
I wanted to ask, I got a question from a listener who was asking about wildfire safety, and you mentioned, the Hills area of Berkeley. It wasn't so long ago that, I know there's a lot of folks who remember the terrifying Hills fires that happened, 25 years ago. What is the city doing to really enforce and reduce wildfire safety and reduce wildfire risk in Berkeley? And what concrete actions can it take to make everyone safer?
Well, first, as people may know, certainly this is reported on, there's been for several months now, people congregating off Grizzly Peak near Tilden Park, along Oakland, UC, and City of Berkeley's jurisdiction, shooting off fireworks and engaging in reckless behavior. And, we've been able to work in coordination with the City of Oakland and UC on a coordinated response. We have fire personnel stationed up there, police. City of Oakland's been doing so as well. We've closed off the turnouts, and hopefully that will deter some of that very reckless behavior, because literally one match can start a very devastating wildfire. And so I know Berkeley residents are deeply concerned about that, and we are taking action to enforce and to limit that kind of dangerous behavior. But we're doing several things. We implemented what's called a Safe Passages program, and we're going to be continuing that, where we're looking at very narrow streets where vehicles being parked will inhibit emergency access and people being able to evacuate. And so we're going to be continuing to implement that program. We're improving our paths, which are another major evacuation route. We funded over $1 million in funding for vegetation management in our parks, and funding to reduce hazardous fuels. And, we're going to have to continue to sustain that. And there is a measure on the ballot, Measure FF, which would provide dedicated funding for our fire and emergency services response and fire prevention. We're also working to access state resources for those initiatives as well. But sadly, wildfire season is not just in the summer months now, it's year round. And so we're going to have to shift our response to be a year-round response and make sure that we have the funding to be able to continue to deal with trees that could pose a great risk, reducing hazardous fuels. We need to beef up our inspection program as well. And so these are all things that we've launched, but that we need to continue to expand upon. And then looking at how we let people know in the event of a major disaster through a warning signal or some sort of notification system.
I know, this idea of the warning system keeps coming up, and we always try to remind people about AC Alert as well, but it's still always a challenge to get the word out about these things. I'm sure we could all keep asking questions, and I don't want to make you have to pry the mic out of our hands. So we will just thank you so much for making yourself available, for the invitation, and we'll hand it back to you now for closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much for participating today and for your questions. I know these are issues that many people in Berkeley are deeply concerned about, and appreciate the opportunity to address and also to talk about the work that we're doing. So during these times of crisis, they really bring out the best of us. And in the face of a crippling pandemic, Berkeley residents have risen to the occasion, and beyond the work that we've discussed, I want to highlight the community response. And even when this crisis was unfolding, residents and strangers teamed up to ensure that their fellow neighbors were safe, creating networks to provide support for those in need. And I think this exemplifies our community's values: compassion, respect for science and following science, and resiliency. And while we have a long journey ahead of us, I'm immensely proud of the efforts that all of us have done to collectively address one of the biggest challenges that we have ever faced as a community. 2020 is going to be etched in the history of our nation. And historians are going to look back at the decisions that we make today, and not just on our response to COVID, but the other issues of our times that are at a crossroads. And what did we do to address our housing and homeless crisis? What actions did we take to address the consequences of climate change? How did we respond to the nationwide push for criminal justice reform after centuries of systemic racism? I'm proud in Berkeley that we've taken action to address these issues, from investing and expanding our affordable housing stock, investing in wildfire safety and hazard mitigation, leading national discussions on transforming policing. We have historically never been afraid to carve a new path forward and to provide bold leadership. And over the past 4 years, I've been able to reflect on what it means to be mayor of the city that we all love in such a pivotal moment in our humanity. And as we always have, Berkeley is in a unique position to be a leader and at the forefront of ingenuity. And as mayor, it is my responsibility to foster that through community engagement and consensus building. Because ultimately, we're all in this together. And whether it's about developing housing at our BART stations or reimagining public safety, we all deserve a seat at the table. And that civic participation is at the core of who we are as a community. And in a city that is as civically engaged as we are, I'm proud and humbled at the work that we've been able to achieve together. In closing, the past month, we've been shrouded in smoke from one of the worst wildfire seasons the West Coast has ever faced. And yet in those very eerily dark Martian-like days, the light of Berkeley shone. Because in a country fraught with fear and uncertainty, Berkeley provides hope and stability. And through the good days and the bad, we can always count on Berkeleyans to step up, even if it's in the difficult tasks that we are facing. So as your mayor, it's been my honor to lead our community and look forward to working with my fellow Berkeleyans in addressing these challenges and blazing a path forward out of the times that we're facing now. So I want to thank the panel for joining us. Thank you for your questions. And thank you to the 152 attendees that participated and the people that will be watching us later on. And have a good evening.